Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into how a totally mundane, boring legal document actually turned out to be one of the most radical, powerful, and potentially dangerous structural inventions in human history. You know, we look at giants like Apple, Amazon, and Toyota today, and they just feel like an ordinary part of life. But think about it for a second. Steve Jobs is gone, right? Yet Apple just marches on. It keeps growing, keeps shaping our world. How is that even legally possible? Well, the underlying idea that made it possible, a structure that's actually larger and longer lived than the people who created it, has completely rewired the world as we know it. So I want you to picture something. Imagine an entity that isn't a kingdom, and it's not an army. And yet, it commands fleets of ships, employs hundreds of thousands of workers, and even negotiates with foreign governments, long after its original founders are buried and gone. What we're really looking at here is the birth of the corporation. It's a concept that didn't just create new businesses, it forged an entirely new form of global power that would eventually rival the very nations that birthed it. To truly get why this structure was invented in the first place, we gotta travel back to the absolutely terrifying 16th and 17th century trade market. European merchants were pushing into new markets across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and the potential profits were just staggering. A single successful cargo of nutmeg could literally be worth its weight in gold. It would make you rich for life. But man, the oceans were an absolute gauntlet. You've got ships sinking in brutal storms, pirates swarming valuable trade routes, wars wiping out cargo, and foreign rulers just arbitrarily seizing your goods. And that's if things went perfectly. Even a flawless voyage took years. One merchant couldn't possibly absorb that kind of monumental danger alone.
So the logical fix to all this immense peril? You distribute the danger. Instead of betting your entire life savings on one single ship, you and 50 of your friends chip in and divide the cost. If the voyage succeeds, everyone shares the profits and gets rich. If it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, well, you distribute the financial losses. You lose a little bit of cash, but you aren't completely ruined. This basic idea was revolutionary for commerce, but it almost immediately hit a massive roadblock when confronted with the reality of human nature.
It created this massive fatal flaw. What happens when ownership changes, or worse, when an investor just dies? How could a business operate, maintain a whole fleet of ships, and plan for decades if its very existence was tied to the fragile, super unpredictable lifespans of its human investors? I mean, a trading expedition could take years, and a company building forts and securing complex trade routes needed to last way longer than one human life. That single flaw sparked a really rapid evolution of legal technology. We can trace this corporate evolution starting in 1600 with the English East India Company, moving right to the Dutch VOC in 1602, jumping to the massive industrial age railroads of the 19th century, and finally arriving at the global conglomerates of the 20th century. The brilliant pivot actually happened in England in 1600 with the East India Company. They weren't just a collection of merchants anymore. They did something completely unprecedented. They effectively severed the business from the mortal humans who owned it. By creating an immortal legal phantom that could continue way beyond its original founders, the corporation became one of the most important inventions in economic history. People could come and go, but the entity itself, it was permanent. By the stroke of Queen Elizabeth I's pen, this new organization gained some truly profound legal identities. It is actually kind of bizarre when you think about it. In the eyes of the law, the company literally became a person. It could own property, enter binding contracts, raise vast sums of capital, employ workers, and sue or be sued in court, all acting as a completely independent, invisible being. It operated seamlessly, entirely unaffected by the mortality of its human shareholders. But the East India Company quickly showed everyone that this immortal structure was capable of terrifying escalation. It went from merely trading goods in small outposts to conquering massive land territories and raising its own standing armies. A private commercial organization was suddenly doing things traditionally reserved for kings and sovereign governments. It started dictating the political and economic destiny of the entire Indian subcontinent. And then in 1602, the Dutch took this geopolitical power even further. With the creation of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, they essentially invented the modern stock market. They consolidated all these competing Dutch trading interests into a single, massive entity where shares could be freely traded. Anyone could own a piece of an empire that built fleets, fought wars, and negotiated treaties entirely on paper without ever having to smell the ocean or manage a single sailor.
Now, as the world eventually moved toward the Industrial Revolution, humanity faced a completely new hurdle. Wooden ships were expensive, sure, but how on earth do you organize enormous amounts of capital around impossibly massive projects, like transcontinental railways or vast telecommunications networks? These physical infrastructures were simply way too large and far too risky for any one person or even a small group of wealthy aristocrats to take on.
The ultimate psychological unlock for this was a concept called limited liability. It was essentially a legal firewall. What it meant was that if you invested in a risky new train line and it went completely bankrupt, your investment was gone, yes, but the bank couldn't come after your personal house or your life savings to pay the company's debts. This incredible legal boundary unlocked an absolute torrent of private capital from everyday people who are suddenly willing to take a chance.
This legal firewall blew the floodgates wide open. Thanks to the combination of collective ownership and limited liability, private capital poured in from thousands of investors simultaneously. That capital was immediately deployed to fund railways, expand massive factories, purchase incredibly expensive mining machinery, and physically stretch telegraph networks across entire nations. The corporation literally became the ultimate catalyst for human development in the 19th century industrial age.
This also forced a completely new relationship between business and time. Think about a local family business. It lives and dies with the family, which fundamentally limits its strategic horizon. But because a corporate institution doesn't have a biological clock and it easily outlives the people inside it, companies could now strategize for centuries ahead. This permanently changed how society viewed investment. You were now funding a permanent institution, not just a mortal entrepreneur. And because of this permanence and immense scale, a defining feature of modern capitalism emerged: professional management. The people with the money no longer had to be the people with the expertise. We see this really clean, structural separation. Step 1, shareholders provide the capital. Step 2, boards provide the oversight. 3, executives make the strategic decisions. And 4, the employees actually operate the organization day to day. This decentralized architecture became the hyper-efficient engine of modern commerce. By the 20th century, companies like General Motors, IBM, and Shell were expanding aggressively across borders. These weren't just businesses anymore. They were complex, global economic machines. They were setting up global supply chains, building research laboratories, running sophisticated advertising departments, scaling mass production factories, and managing global distribution. They dictated what we bought and completely reshaped human culture and consumer behavior. However, to truly understand this tool, we have to impartially look at the whole picture. This structure is a massive double-edged sword, and it has created some serious problems. Historically, this meant the violent extractive monopolies of the VOC. Today, massive corporate scale severely reduces market competition and can heavily influence national governments. Distant workers become highly vulnerable to decisions made thousands of miles away, and often environmental costs are distributed across society, while the profits remain strictly private. Ultimately, it is absolutely crucial to recognize that a corporation isn't inherently a hero and it's not inherently a villain. It is simply a tool. It's a brilliant piece of social architecture designed for organizing human effort and capital. Think of it like a hammer. It can be used to build a house, or it can be used to tear one down. Its societal impact depends entirely on how humanity chooses to wield it, monitor it, and regulate it. If there's one thing you take away from this explainer today, let it be this thought. The most powerful business innovations aren't always products. Sometimes they're structures. We obsess over physical things like the smartphone or the airplane, right? But this invisible legal structure, a new way to organize people, put a boundary on risk, and turn scattered individual resources into concentrated collective power, expanded the limits of what humans could achieve way more than any single piece of hardware ever could. Hundreds of years after that very first royal charter, the world's largest companies are still built on these exact same 4 principles for building an empire. Step 1, make the institution bigger than the individual. Step 2, give capital a rigid structure. Step 3, give risk a legal boundary. And Step 4, give the organization enough time to outlive its founders. When you do that, you don't just create a temporary venture. You create a sprawling, self-sustaining empire. Today, we live in a modern world that is completely designed from the ground up by these immortal machines. A handful of global companies now operate at scales larger than the economies of entire nations, serving billions of us every single day. Which leaves us with one incredibly haunting question for the future. When an entity outlives its creators, holds more wealth than a country, and impacts billions of lives, who is truly pulling the strings? The people or the machine? Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the structures around you.